They wheeled the crate into Lab 3 at 2 in the morning, the kind of hour that makes fluorescent light feel like interrogation. It was a refrigerated shipping container, aluminum, dented, the faded stamp of a forestry contractor on one corner. A man from Fish and Wildlife had signed his name on a clipboard, his breath fogging in the cold. Outside, rain tapped the roof like a metronome. Inside, the crate smelled of metal and dry ice, and something older, a scent I would learn to name only slowly, the faint, animal odor of dense fur and warm flesh cooling into stillness. I had been doing molecular work long enough to move through ritual. Gloves, sterile scalpels, clean drapes. The staff hovered around the door and then filed out as I gave them the look that meant no pictures, no one in here. For a long time after I first opened the lid, I did not speak. The body laid in the crate with arms folded, as if someone had tried to preserve a posture of sleep. It was the size of a man but broader at the chest, each hand ending in thick fingers and nails that looked more like worn bone than what we expect to find in human hands. Coarse, dark fur covered the shoulders and back. The face, here is where every attempt at immediate description dissolves into inadequate adjectives, had a forehead, a brow ridge, separated eyes that did not stare like a predator's. It had a mouth that could laugh or cry, lips, a flattened nose, a heavy jaw. My first impression was not of monsters, it was of kinship. Then the training took over. Photographs, external measurements, photographs again. Tissue samples taken from the thigh, the heart, a small fragment from beneath the scalp. Samples labeled, frozen, catalogued. I called a radiologist friend to get a rough skeletal image. We moved at the clinical pace of people who must not let wonder pollute method. That first night, I did what any responsible scientist would do. I assumed error. We had cases of mislabeling, of deer with odd growths, of hoaxes, so I exercised caution. But by the time we had run a few preliminary gels and a southern blot for mitochondrial markers, the possibility of error narrowed into near certainty. The mitochondrial sequence we pulled matched primate sequences in the database close enough to show a primate lineage. Once you see that pattern, the characteristic repeat bands, the way the ladder lines up, it rewires thinking. You go from maybe to this requires urgency. If this is the sort of thing you want to follow to the end, then stay with me through the night. There are things I cannot say publicly, there are others I will explain in full here because my obligation is first to the truth in the data, and second to the moral argument that data made unavoidable. We were working in November of 1995. The Human Genome Project had been underway for a few years.
Our sequencing tools were Sanger reads, gels, and capillary machines that spat out fragments in a way that today seems painstaking. Whole genome shotgun sequencing was a dream on the horizon. Still, what we could do was enough to rule things in or out. Mitochondrial sequences, karyotyping, and targeted nuclear markers. Those three things together would tell me two critical things quickly: relatedness and evolution, and less pleasantly, vulnerability. The karyotype was the first thing that stopped my breath. We cultured lymphocytes from a peripheral blood sample, captured mitotic spreads under a microscope, and arranged the chromosomes according to size and banding patterns the way we had all been taught in grad school. 48. I had to count twice. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans have 44 or 46 depending on species, with their own characteristic fusions and rearrangements. A count of 48 is not a casual error. It is a structural statement about ancestry and divergence. It suggests a lineage close enough to ours to share much of the same genome, but different enough to bear an additional chromosomal pair. The implications unfurled like a map. Next came mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial genomes are small, maternally inherited, and evolve at a clock-like pace that, with assumptions, can be turned into rough time estimates. When I aligned the sequence we had with the database, the divergence from Homo sapiens mitochondria was small in evolutionary terms, but significant, enough to suggest a split on the order of 1 million years, give or take. In plain terms, the maternal line of this specimen had been separate from ours long before modern humans established their current genetic signature. It did not make it alien, it made it a cousin on an odd branch of the hominin tree. And then we started to compare specific nuclear regions. We targeted genes that matter for identification and for biology. Cytochrome B in mitochondria, a suite of autosomal microsatellites, some loci within the major histocompatibility complex, and a handful of neurodevelopmentally relevant genes. The numbers do not convey the human feeling of the discovery, so I will translate. One of the earliest estimates we had, and remember, all of these should be framed as the best interpretation of the available data, suggested about 98.7% sequence similarity across examined loci with modern humans. That is a shorthand. It meant, at sites we compared, the nucleotide sequences matched modern human sequences in most positions and diverged in others. It was similar to what we would see between ourselves and the great apes, but closer. The little differences that remained, when taken together with the karyotype and the mitochondrial separation, suggested a lineage of hominins that sat near Homo in the evolutionary neighborhood.
When the lab spreadsheets began to look like a story, the story itself introduced moral gravity. Quickly, before the data could be misinterpreted at cocktail parties or reduced to tabloid headlines, we ran markers that told us about immune function. The genes of the major histocompatibility complex, the MHC, are the immunological fingerprint of a population's history. They diversify in the face of pathogens. Populations exposed to a wide range of microbes tend to carry diverse MHC alleles, which makes them less likely to be overwhelmed by new infections. What we found instead was a startling paucity of variation. The alleles present in the specimen's MHC were limited and closely related. In lay terms, this animal's immune system had not been forged by the same microbial diversity that forged ours. It looked naive, exquisitely vulnerable to pathogens that humans carry as routine traffic through our societies. Population models built from runs of homozygosity and microsatellite diversity told a further dark story. The genome carried long stretches where both copies matched almost identically, the genomic signature of inbreeding. When individuals share many of the same ancestors, their genomes show these long identical segments because the same ancestral chromosome has been inherited twice. Statistically, the effective population size inferred from the samples suggested a small number. I say suggested because it is based on a single specimen and a handful of loci. Good science names its limits. But even conservative extrapolations pointed to a population in severe isolation, one likely inbreeding depression, and what demographers call an extinction vortex. A cycle in which reduced genetic health lowers survival, which reduces numbers, which in turn reduces genetic diversity further. Put simply, if they still existed in any appreciable number, they could be wiped out by a single common human pathogen. There are moral stakes to raw numbers. Scientists are trained to publish. Publication is how hypotheses become part of the common store of knowledge. Publishing would mean inviting others to examine the data, to test it, to build on it. But publishing also means putting coordinates and descriptions into a public arena in which curiosity, commerce, and hunger for exploitation coexist. To take a more immediate example, if our work was cited by a conservationist, it might generate protection. If it were cited by a private collector or by a misguided hunting party, it could lead to the removal or destruction of the last survivors. The ethics in front of me were not abstract. They were sharply practical. Into that breach came the bureaucracy. They arrived over the next 48 hours in the kind of concentric, choreographic way that secrecy tends to do. First, Fish and Wildlife. Agent Richard Cole, a man with the steady, bureaucratic face of someone who has watched policy replace panic 1,000 times.
He asked procedural questions about chain of custody and corpse disposition. He did it with professional softness, as if that could blunt whatever was coming. Sarah Martinez, their counsel, was precise and quiet. Legal language is a weapon whose blunt edge is an entire field of power. Then came a paramedic from the nearby base who had been sent with a body bag, as if to remind us of the formalities that keep institutions from crumbling into rumor. Within a day, a representative from the CDC came through the back door. He introduced himself with a name that would bounce around in our files, and in print it would appear with variant spellings, because memory and bad transcription do that. But his title was Public Health Response. He did not promise alarmist language. He only asked questions about pathogens. Those questions were the right ones. What happened next was, in its own way, a choreography of administrative containment. There were non-disclosure forms, signatures written in ink that will sour conversations for decades. The Institute's director, Dr. Patricia Walsh, sat in on meetings I thought she should not have had to sit in on. A sterile room, a projector clicking, slides that rearranged the implications from biological curiosity to biosecurity risk. They spoke in hedges and clauses. They argued about what could be said to the staff, to the public, to the tribal communities upstream. At one point, a man in plain clothes, a military liaison who identified himself as attached to a base down at Fort Lewis, said the word classification. He used it with a tone that suggested it was both a tool and a location, and everyone in the room understood. It would be dishonest to pretend that the moment those men sat on the same side of the table was not the moment the human drama entered full force. The ethical equation shifted. Conservation and curiosity became entangled with national policy, and when national policy joined scientific evidence, the choices became legal as well as moral. Among those choices was the question of custody. The body could be taken, sequestered in military cold storage, examined by teams whose clearances exceeded our reputations. Or the lab could retain custody under federal agreement. That option came with paperwork, a contract that recognized the institute as a node in a classified monitoring program. The contract would pay for maintaining the specimens and for continued monitoring, and would bind us not to disclose details without authorization. In practical terms, it meant the government would compensate us for our work and also secure our silence. I want to be clear about that payment because the title line people will use to sell stories later hinges on it. I was paid. I signed an agreement that compensated me for my participation in a monitoring and stewardship arrangement.
It was not ransom or reward in any tawdry sense. It was a formal consulting arrangement that covered personnel costs, secure facility upkeep, and what the Federal Council called continuity of custody. Payments were routed through the Institute, which then allocated funds for overtime, for equipment, for a secure freezer that stayed in the building but had a lock code controlled by a federal liaison. The first time Agent Cole handed me the folder with the standard issue stamp and the contract inside, I felt my professional vanity shrink. To be paid by a government program to guard the container of someone you might call a sentient being is a strange kind of professional crossroad. You are still a scientist, and you are now, in part, an instrument of state stewardship. You are paid to protect, not to weaponize. You are asked to balance transparency and secrecy. There is dignity in that. There is also the slow erosion of academic autonomy. I signed after arguing points that should matter. Chain of custody protocols, a limited list of permitted analyses, a guarantee, which I took on faith and later learned to suspect, that indigenous communities would be consulted as custodians with preference. Those clauses mattered. They were the scaffolding on which I believed a moral case could stand. But when an institution like the federal government offers compensation, there is always a question of leverage. Money makes obligations not merely moral, but contractual. That is how they paid me to guard. This is not how one imagines a guardian. Guardianship in the stories I grew up with is romantic, a torch, a vow, a lone figure at a gate. Real guardianship, in my experience, reads like ledger entries and a stack of signed forms. It arrives with limitations and penalties and the sense that you are now responsible not only for the specimen, but for the ripple effects of what you do with it. Dr. Margaret Chen entered the narrative within those 2 days like a voice that made the data breathe. Retired now from active fieldwork, she had spent 20 years walking backcountry trails and listening to the people who live there. Her name carried the gravitas of many seasons in the hills and a patience that comes from watching patterns emerge over decades. She did not bring a notebook as much as she brought stories, artifacts, and casts. Footprint molds taken from river silt, stone arrangements that did not look utilitarian, a cache of audio tapes where low rhythmic calls could be heard between wind and the creak of branches. The quality of her field notes was not the sort of thing that dominates peer-reviewed journals, but it was the kind of social evidence that complicates sterile models. Where our DNA said possible, she could point to patterns in the landscape that said present. She also brought caution.
Her approach was one of ethical humility towards the indigenous knowledge holders in the region, the Coast Salish communities, who had maintained oral histories and protocols about these beings for generations. She pressed us to include their voices not as data points but as stakeholders. There were elders whom she described with respect, people who had been reluctant to speak to researchers because the act of naming and claiming can sometimes become the first step toward exploitation. Margaret insisted we honor their preferences, anonymity when requested, shared stewardship in a model that recognized indigenous custodianship of both knowledge and land. If there is a single moral through line I would insist on now, it is this. The communities that have long lived closest to a thing often know the thing's rhythms better than an outsider who finds a specimen in a box. They see seasons, tracks, behavior. They interpret meaning. Scientific analysis without that ethical engagement risks turning living cultures and living creatures into specimens for a lab notebook and nothing more. The meetings multiplied. I had one-on-one sessions with Dr. Lisa Yamamoto, a postdoc whose hands never stopped moving when she spoke about sequences and phylogenies. She wanted open data. She wanted to publish and to test the boundaries of what the genome could tell us about cognition and morphology. I respected her hunger. I felt it as I felt it in myself. Yet hunger meets systems of governance that do not always reward hunger in the same way. Sarah Martinez, the counsel, explained the legal liabilities with a calm I could not replicate. The military liaison spoke in hypotheticals and risk assessments about habitat protection, about the optics of disclosure. The CDC NAN talked about routine human pathogens, influenza, respiratory syncytial virus, adenoviruses. He drew a table on a whiteboard showing how quickly a naive immune system could be devastated by common human microbes. The more we added voices, the more the moral geometry of the problem tightened into a fork. Publish and possibly doom. Withhold and possibly deny knowledge to the world that could change how we think about ourselves. I will not romanticize my decision. I will say plainly that my choice was shaped by data and by an ethical judgment that prioritized living beings over publication records. There was, too, a personal price. I was a divorced man in my 40s who had given the better part of his life to science and had a daughter, Rebecca, who lived on the other side of the city. I remember sitting in the empty kitchen, the contract folded on the table, and thinking about what it meant to trade a public career for the silence required by the agreement. I thought about my name on tenure files and the possibility that future historians would call me a coward or a saint, depending on what they wanted to believe.
Those are vanity versus conscience calculations that many scientists imagine only in private. When they become official, the calculation weighs heavier than a grant review. There is a peculiar loneliness that comes with being charged to guard something the world has not yet earned the right to know. People will imagine drama, clandestine vans, threats whispered in alleyways, violent skirmishes with men in black. There was none of that. There was paperwork, oversight, and a constant low hum of bureaucratic logic. The guards who worked the institute at night were polite union men who checked in and out. I sat with the refrigerated crate in the middle of the lab and read sequence alignments until my eyes blurred. I watched the rain make little rivers down the windows, imagining somehow a forest of Douglas firs back where the crate had come from. Then, on the fourth night, the cameras picked up a person. The cameras were not state-of-the-art, even by 1995 standards. They were analog security cameras with timestamps that sometimes skipped frames. We had them monitoring the loading bay because protocol required chain of custody visuals whenever a high-profile specimen arrived or left. Reviewing the tape became part of the routine. The footage at 2:47 a.m. was grainy and breathy with static, but the posture and the light was clear. The figure approached the crate with deliberate steps. They did not move like someone trying to steal. They moved like someone who recognized the thing inside. They paused. One arm lifted and stayed there. Fingers hovered for a moment over the sealed lid. Then the figure pressed their forehead to the container in a way that read, for those who had seen grief before, as a gesture of mourning. You should know what followed. When you are paid to guard, you do not interpret grainy footage by the theater of your imagination. You call the council, you call the tribal contacts Dr. Chen recommended, you call the federal liaison. You re-watch the tape with people who can read gesture with different cultural fluencies. Some saw a trespasser. Margaret saw a known pattern of visitation she had observed in the field. Small acts performed near caches or sleeping sites, a ritual of return. A tribal elder, his voice thick with long years, said no. That posture was familiar in the language of their people when someone came near a site of passing. He asked for privacy, for patience. He asked that we not institutionalize the creature with headlines. The cameras had done something else too. They allowed me, as a scientist trained to translate images into hypotheses, to update the model I had been building from DNA alone. If behavior suggests sociality, if a conspecific visits the resting place, then you are dealing with a creature that has bonds and memory. That moved the ethical scale another notch. The federal apparatus, when presented with images that implied social behavior, recalibrated. That is perhaps inevitable.
The men behind desks are not cruel, they are constrained by mandates. But when a species is both genetically vulnerable and behaviorally sentient, the risk calculus changes into duty. Duty to prevent suffering, duty to prevent zoonosis, duty to prevent public panic. The options on the table multiplied in number and in constraint. The negotiation that followed was not a scene from a thriller. It was a series of meetings where language mattered. Custody sounded different from possession. Monitoring sounded different from containment. Sarah Martinez drafted an amendment to the contract that acknowledged indigenous stakeholder voice in decisions about disposition. Agent Cole and I argued over the conditions under which the container might be transported back to a remote site. Dr. Chen insisted on the presence of community representatives if that were to happen. The CDC man insisted on certain biosafety measures on any transport, no matter how respectful the intent. The military observer recommended that any field return be accompanied by a small, discreet perimeter to prevent accidental encounters with hikers. I argued for dignity. You may wonder how a scientist balances the impulse to publish with the obligation to protect. For me, the deciding factor was simple and brutal. If the publication of coordinates or specific morphological details would make the creature easier to find, and if finding them could lead to exposure to human pathogens that would decimate a naive immune system, then publication would be tantamount to a slow biological execution. A scientist's duty is to knowledge, but it is also to the living systems one studies. There are principles of non-maleficence in field biology as in medicine. First, do no harm. The contract recognized that calculus. It paid us in ways that underwrote the protection option,
a secure freezer, resources for remote camera deployment, funds for field liaison that would go to local guardians rather than to extractionist researchers. I took the payment not with the lightness of someone who had won an honor, but with the heavy acceptance of someone who knows his signature will bind him in ways that will be tested in the months and years to come. Even as these administrative choices were being made, my own laboratory work kept pulling me back to the bench. There is a strange solace in data. It allows you to bracket emotion and examine the world in terms you can test and replicate. In those days, we ran additional analyses: telomere length, which can suggest biological age at the cellular level, allelic diversity across multiple microsatellite loci, sequencing of genes related to neurodevelopment. The telomeres were neither exceptionally short nor exceptionally long. The animal's cellular clock looked like that of a mature adult, not a child or an ancient elder. Neurodevelopmental gene comparisons were tantalizing and deeply tentative.
Patterns suggested a brain organized in ways that would permit social cognition, circuitry for vocalization, motor coordination for tool use, the sort of neural investment in hands and social processing that in Homo correlate with culture. We could not ever know mind from genome alone, but the material record, coupled with the field observations of tool-bearing nests, stone placements, and the audio tapes of rhythmic calls, made an ethical mosaic. We were confronted with a being that occupied a liminal place, close enough to earn the label of hominin, distinct enough to challenge easy definitions, socially invested enough to merit moral consideration. At the end of the week, the council presented me with an option. The federal program would fund me to be a node in a monitoring network. I would be paid as a consultant and as a custodian. The agreement would permit certain analyses, but would forbid public release of identifying details without clearance. The agreement also required that I participate in a management plan that prioritized returning remains to the landscape in cases of mortality, and in giving preference to tribal custodianship in any ceremonial disposition. In short, they paid me to guard not just the cold box, but in some measure the secrets that might endanger living others. I signed the agreement because I believed at the time that it offered the best balance of duty. I did so knowing that there would be repercussions, professional, social, and personal. It is worth saying plainly that taking that money did not feel like selling out. It felt like a constrained acceptance of a painful truth. Sometimes stewardship is not a romantic vigil, but a contract with legal language. That night, after the papers were filed and the signatures dried, I sat alone in Lab 3 with the lid partly closed and the monitors playing static. I could have handed custody to the military team and walked away. I could have called a press conference and let the world decide. Instead, I sat and watched the rain and thought about two things: a child's small hand, my grandson Marcus's, and the history etched in the face of an elder from the Coast Salish community who had looked at the grainy footage and sighed, saying, "They visit, they remember." There is no facile equation that equates my personal ties to my decisions, but they are part of the moral calculus. We do not make decisions in sterile vacuum. What I did not know then, what I could not predict, even with models and markers in the council of technically brilliant colleagues, was how the push and pull of secrecy and exposure would change everything around me. The administrative tapes, the non-disclosure agreements, the payments through the institute would not be what ultimately shaped my life.
My life was changed by the burden of knowing what publication might do, by the taste of the responsibility to protect, and by choices that would make me less visible in the very arenas where scientific reputations are built. In retrospect, the agreement to be paid to guard marked the moment when I ceased to be the kind of scientist who could shout from the lab bench and became instead someone who shepherded silence. The pay was explicit, the cost was not. The cost would come in years, in opportunities lost, in friends who later distanced themselves, in invitations that curiously evaporated once I stopped sending in papers to conferences that prized novelty and openness above discretion. It was the professional equivalent of stepping behind a curtain. The meetings that followed threaded the needle between protection and paternalism. We proposed a plan to attempt a dignified return of the specimen to a site chosen in consultation with indigenous custodians, with remote cameras, and with none of the fanfare of a press release. The CDC insisted on biosafety protocols. The military suggested non-recognition through other public projects, a habitat restoration grant, a road closure for erosion control that would actually restrict human access to a valley. It felt like theater of misdirection in a public square. Use one formal process to hide another. I accepted warily, because conservation often requires camouflage within bureaucracy. There is a key procedural detail I will not omit. As part of the monitoring program, the Institute received funds explicitly earmarked for remote camera deployment. The idea was simple: document the site at a distance and learn without intruding. The cameras, placed on logs and trees, were to be small and non-invasive. We trained them on the clearing but kept lenses far enough away to avoid intimate intrusion. The point of this was not voyeurism, it was risk assessment and behavioral understanding. If the creatures were social and mourning, the footage would be evidence of ethical stakes beyond genomic statistics. On the morning the cameras were installed, Dr. Chen and I stood in the drizzle under a canopy of firs and watched the crew set a tripod camera on a low limb. She pinched the bridge of her nose and said, "We do this because some things can't be measured in numbers." Then she smiled, the kind of smile that admits the world is both terrible and beautiful. I agreed. We both knew the stakes were higher than publication. And then, because even a long narrative must concede to practical decisions, Agent Cole came to me with a new request that made me feel, in the way that only heavy moral choices will, that the decision was no longer just about data. He asked whether I would personally oversee the field transfer.
He put it plainly. Given your familiarity with the specimen, your signed contract, and your standing with the Institute, would you be willing to accompany the transport in order to maintain chain of custody and to act as a scientific observer? That question had the shape of both honor and trap. My answer at first was procedural. I said yes in the way a person says yes to a difficult duty, because to refuse would be to hand the decision to others who might not share the same ethical priorities. There was also, uncomfortably, the knowledge that by accepting I would be physically present for an act of return, to witness the consequence of either our silence or our publication. If we returned the body, what would the scene mean to those who came to it? The drive to the clearing the next day was quiet. The road narrowed into a track, and then into a trail. We moved with a few people, 2 federal agents, a small field crew from the Institute, Dr. Chen and me, and a liaison from the Coast Salish community who asked to remain unnamed in any public files. The crate in the back of the truck sat under a tarp. Every mile we drove felt like a mile further from the possibility of public recognition, and a mile closer to the possibility of either mercy or catastrophe. We arrived at a place where the forest opened onto a small meadow, a clearing that had been used as a resting site by generations of creatures, if one trusted the footprint patterns in the oral histories. The sky was mottled. The men who came with us set up a simple perimeter and then withdrew. The idea was to make the return as intimate and small as possible. My hand shook when we lowered the crate and peeled back the lid. The face that looked up at me then was not the same as the night in Lab 3 under stark light. It was a face warmed by sunlight, by the chorus of wind through branches. For a moment I thought I could hear, in the silence, the echo of the low calls on Margaret's tapes. One of the men in the perimeter shifted in his boots. I remember thinking with sharp clarity that whatever we did in those next minutes would anchor a story that would outlive us. We set the body on a bed of moss. The liaison spoke in his language, a few words shared with a translator. He performed a small ritual of respect I will never forget, placing cedar and tobacco near the mouth, pressing hands to the chest in a posture that our legal papers never could have prescribed. The creatures, when they came, and when they did come, did not rush. They approached like relatives approaching a place of memory. They touched the body in gentleness that belonged to species who carried sorrow. And then a sound rose through the clearing that was not in our notes or our models, a low, inconclusive series of vocalizations that to my ear read as structured and mournful. It was not language in any human sense. It was not silent either.
It was enough to remind me that science sometimes studies things that are first mortal actors and only then data sets. The cameras, distant and unobtrusive, captured the moment. They preserved a sequence of images, figures bending, touching, bending again, and then lifting the body as if to carry it away. The footage would later be cataloged, encrypted, and archived in a safe with 2 federal keys. It would later be used as evidence in internal memos to justify habitat protection under other names. But in the clearing that day, there was no document. There was only care. I could have chosen, then and there, to walk into any office and tell the world what I have seen. I could have run to any microphone and given the sequence to journalists with the talent for making headlines. Instead, I closed my mouth, I signed the paperwork, and I watched 2 figures carry a body into the trees until they became small and then invisible. I have never pretended that the choice to prioritize silence is morally clean. It is messy and compromised. It is also the choice I made because, when faced with a species whose immune repertoire suggested that a cough from a human could be their undoing, silence felt less like cowardice and more like mercy.
The consequences began almost immediately. Friends who expected scientific openness began to ask hard questions. Grant panels questioned my priorities. Young colleagues who had once looked to me for collaboration found the temerity of secrecy to be an affront to the ethos of open science. I lost opportunities in ways that people who have not stood in this moral geometry might not imagine. My name grew quieter at conferences. The publication records I had once hoped would be my legacy stalled like a breath held too long. But there was another kind of consequence, quieter and more profound. My relationship with the Coast Salish communities deepened in forms that did not show up on a CV. They sent me letters, and once a carved cedar figure of thanks for respecting a request to prioritize ceremony over spectacle. I kept those letters in a drawer, folded and worn, because I believed that true stewardship requires humility and assumption of error and harm. At times, late at night, I let myself imagine what might have happened had I chosen differently. A paper in a high-profile journal, the world agog, a flood of people into the valleys, the mating of curiosity and tourism and extraction. The probability, given the genomic signs of immune naivete, that an epidemic could sweep through a small population and extinguish it. Those were not thought experiments. They were risk assessments with human faces. So I stayed quiet. I was paid to guard. I guarded. The payment did not remove the private ache of scientific exile. It did not absolve me of all responsibility either. It simply shifted the stage on which I acted. The evening after the return, I sat on my porch and lit a cigarette I rarely smoked.
The city lights blinked in the distance. Rebecca called and asked about an upcoming symposium I had been invited to months before. I made up an excuse, a sudden commitment to a monitoring schedule, and then told her the simple truth about being tired. She pressed me lightly about the papers. I changed the subject. I am not proud of that distance. I tell you now because intimacy with consequence is part of the ledger I carry. What I will not do is craft a melodrama about enemies at the door. There were no cloaked figures hauling bodies into vans. What there was, rather, was the steady, bureaucratic machinery of institutions balancing duties. There were ethical people in government and in the institute who wanted to prevent harm. There were also tensions that I was not naive enough to overlook. The temptation of sensational discovery, the privilege of institutions to prioritize their reputations, the quiet economics that flow in the margins of any tax-supported program. It would be reasonable at this stage of the story to think that the problem had been solved. That a body returned, cameras deployed, and a contract signed would close the circle and seal the matter into the kind of quiet that protects rather than provokes. I believed that for a while. I believed that because I wanted to believe it, and because the machinery we had set in motion seemed, on paper, to be exactly the kind of careful, bureaucratic buffer the situation required. It did not take long for that paper to crease. The first crack was not wild. It arrived as a small, formal notice in my institute mailbox, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a law student representing a local paper, asking for records of interagency agreements and procurement orders relating to wildlife monitoring. The request was narrow and by FOIA standards routine. What was not routine was the way that one document led to another. Contracts spawn invoices. Invoices reference subcontractors. Subcontractors keep receipts. A year later, the student had a stack of redactor PDFs and a reporter with enough curiosity to file follow-ups. A reporter that year had more than curiosity. He had readers, and crucially, he had a taste for narrative. The documents that seeped into public awareness did not name creatures. They did not say Bigfoot or hominin, but what they did show in black and white budgets and line items, in references to security upgrades, cold storage, and remote monitoring contracted to academic labs, suggested something that could be read two ways. Beneath innocuous language lay an extraordinary implication, a federal effort to underwrite, to study, and to protect an unusual biological finding. When an implication that large collides with a public hungry for the extraordinary, interpretations proliferate. From the moment the first article ran, the tenor of our work changed.
The Institute's phone lines filled with calls from activists, skeptics, and people who wanted to help in ways that ranged from generous to dangerous. Bloggers, a new and unruly species of commentator, turned the story into a narrative about secrecy and primal evidence. Conspiracy websites magnified the gaps left by redaction into entire architectures of wrongdoing. Mainstream outlets, cautious at first, began to press because sources kept offering tantalizing, though incomplete documents. The Federal Liaison's Office received an avalanche of FOIA requests that the redaction team could not keep up with. Those were the public reverberations. Closer to home, the leak, imperfect, partial, and not intentionally malicious, altered institutional behavior. The Institute, which had sought the contract to secure scientific and ethical stewardship, found itself pressured by boards and donors who feared liability and reputational risk. Grants were scrutinized in a new light. The General Counsel's office recommended reassigning sensitive personnel and tightening internal access. The result was the very thing we had feared. Visibility began to attract attention to the thing we were trying to shield. When the story made the front page of a regional paper and then compiled into a segment on a national evening newscast, my own name, careful, defensive, and often anonymized in the early reporting, began to appear with it. I had always treated the payments in the contract as elements of a stewardship model, not a source of shame. But bills and headlines do not parse nuance the way a laboratory spreadsheet does. They reduce complexity into sound bites. Paid to guard became the 5-word rhythm repeated across shows, each repetition nudging the public imagination toward a simpler, angrier story. Taxpayer money spent to hide something unusual from the public. That anger had consequences. A congressional oversight subcommittee requested materials. The Institute complied with the narrowest legal reading, but oversight hearings are not technical seminars. They are political performances, where the expectation of transparency can be weaponized into a demand for spectacle. Advocacy groups demanded open data. Some insisted that the choice to withhold meant the government had something to hide. Others had the opposite reaction, an urgent plea to protect the site. Federal lawyers, worn thin and mindful of precedent, advised the agencies to consolidate authority. They recommended classification where the redaction team had not thought to apply it, arguing that any further slippage endangered not only a species, but also public safety and tribal rights. In the weeks that followed, I found myself sitting in rooms filled with more men in suits and fewer men with lab notebooks. It was a shift anyone in science knows. When your work intersects with policy, you are no longer judged only by the clarity of your data, but by the rhetorical leverage of your statements.
The scientist's instinct is often to resist that arena. My instinct was complicated by something deeper, an ongoing, real worry that public attention would bring people into the valleys. Not all of them would come with good intent. Not all would come to learn. Some would come to hunt, to photograph, to claim a trophy. In my models, in my mind's risk calculations, that was the greater threat. There were procedural remedies under discussion, stronger sealing of files, rerouting of future payments through intermediary conservation trusts, and expanded partnerships with tribal authorities to declare parts of the watershed as culturally protected zones. All of these were sensible steps, and, at least in principle, desirable. But bureaucratic remedies are slow and imperfect, and time, until now, had been a friend to us. The camera's presence in the clearing had been discreet, slow to attract attention. Once the press moved in, time compressed. Journalists wanted immediacy. Readers wanted follow-up. The places we had tried to protect with camouflage became vulnerable to attention itself. I will not pretend the pressure was only external. Internal tensions rose as well. Dr. Lisa Yamamoto, younger, brilliant, and hungry, could not reconcile the silence with her training. She believed strongly in the ethos of open science and argued publicly, as far as was prudent, that withholding data corroded trust between scientists and public. Her voice had moral force. I had once been her age and carried the same hunger in my chest. I could not dismiss it. But every public argument for openness needed to be weighted against a biological reality that none of us wished to trivialize, an immune system in our specimen that looked to the MHC alleles and the homozygosity runs, dangerously underexposed to human pathogens. We tried to find a middle path. We proposed a peer review framework where selected, cleared scientists would examine data under confidentiality agreements. We suggested embargoes, controlled releases of non-identifying results, and an expanded role for tribal advisory councils in deciding the terms of disclosure. Some agencies accepted such proposals. Others pushed for more sweeping transparency, a public accounting, a press tour, a shared archive. The tensions were not merely practical. They were, in a sense, ontological. Are we dealing with an object of science or a population of beings with claims to privacy and dignity? It was in the midst of these debates that something else happened. An anonymous envelope arrived on my doorstep containing a single photograph. It was grainy, printed on ordinary paper. The image showed a pair of large footprints on a wet rock face, each print like a hand turned inward. Someone had taken it in the field, the metadata stripped, the corners dog-eared. There was no note, no claim. I took the photograph to Dr. Chen and to the tribal liaison. She only said quietly, "They have ways of showing us they are there."
The photograph did not change legal arguments. It changed me. It reminded me that while we argued about publication and sovereignty, something lived on the landscape that did not ask our permission to exist. When the oversight hearings came, I was called. I did the thing a person in my position must do. I answered questions candidly about methods and cautious about specifics. I explained the genetic results in ways intended to be accessible. I compared telomeres to a cellular clock. I explained how a naive MHC profile increases vulnerability. I described in plain terms what long runs of homozygosity mean for a small population. But I refused to disclose site coordinates, to name names of local custodians who had requested anonymity, or to turn the filmed mourning into a public spectacle. I did this not out of contempt for openness, but out of a deliberate ethic of harm minimization. Politically, my refusal made me an awkward witness. Some members of the committee called for subpoenas. Others argued that what I guarded was not merely biological, but a matter of cultural sovereignty and good science. The headlines spun. "Scientist refuses to reveal site," read one column. "Government pays for secrecy," read another. The internet, still young but ferocious, supplied both outraged commentators and sympathetic voices. At home, my daughter Rebecca called less often. "Dad, are you sure?" she asked on one of the rare evenings we spoke. Her voice had the weary, practical concern of someone watching a parent be devoured by a process they cannot attend to. When I tried to explain why I stayed silent, she responded with a line I would hear from others later. Or, "Are you hiding something you wish you had done differently?" There are no easy answers to such questions. The personal costs I had anticipated arrived with a slow, inevitable grind. Grants evaporated as committees worried about entanglement. Collaborative invitations flagged, then fell silent. Colleagues who once shared breakfasts with me sent me polite notes from a distance. My name, the currency I had used to buy equipment and to shepherd students through graduate school, became less valuable in the market. Institutions that prized publicity and citation counts regard long silences as professional voids. I could have insisted otherwise, argued the ethics publicly until the world understood, but one cannot fight institutional incentives with moral speeches alone. There was, however, an unexpected counterweight. The Coast Salish community, whose elders had cautioned against spectacle from the start, sent me small acts of trust. An elder I will call Lummy Nook, a generous name in his language that I use here with permission to protect his privacy, slipped me a packet of dried cedar and a short letter asking for continued discretion. "We have lived with them," he wrote in translation, "and we can teach how to watch without taking."
That letter, folded and worn at the edges, was a moral anchor in a way no contract could be. The public pressure reached a sort of fever in the summer after the hearings. An activist group organized a protest outside the institute. The police presence was substantial, but peaceful. Protesters chanted for disclosure, some held up cardboard signs, others held images of stylized footprints and slogans about the people's right to know. The protest was, in its own way, a test of the public's appetite for myth versus the public's appetite for protection. The police filed incident reports, journalists filed stories. The Institute issued a short, careful statement repeating that it had cooperated with relevant authorities and that it could not discuss ongoing investigations. The statement satisfied no one. In private, the agencies enacted a change in posture. What had been an informal monitoring program became, in effect, a more formalized protective regime. Conservation grants were restructured. Land use projects in adjacent valleys were quietly rebudgeted to create greater buffers under the rubric of watershed restoration. It was the same camouflage we had used earlier, but now it was institutionalized through appropriated funds, rather than through the vaguer mechanisms of misdirection. For the creatures, the result may have been beneficial. For me, it had mixed effects. The program's evolution meant more resources for protection, but it also meant more institutional hands on the steering wheel, and thus more policy debate about what counted as acceptable secrecy. At the same time, something else shifted in me. The relentless scrutiny and the tug of public interest made public life intolerable. I could have decided to double down, to write the book that would explain the science, to give the interviews, to own the controversy and attempt to steer it into an ethical argument about stewardship. Many urged me to do exactly that. Dr. Yamamoto, especially, counseled me to publish a sanitized but truthful account of the genomic data and to use it to create a framework for ethical disclosure. She wanted a model other scientists could follow. I wanted that too, but my judgment took a different path.
I believed the immediate risk to living beings overrode the potential medium-term gain of shifting public norms. So instead of a public book, I wrote what I called, half in irony, a hypothetical account. It resembled a book in format: chapters on genetics, chapters on population dynamics and epidemiology, chapters on indigenous ethics and the philosophy of personhood. But I never intended it for mass publication. I circulated it privately to a handful of colleagues, to tribal advisors, and to a lawyer who advised on confidentiality matters. The manuscript existed as a kind of ethical ledger, a record of what we had found, why we made certain choices, and what conditions might justify different choices in the future.
The manuscript also served another purpose. In quiet conversations with a few trusted journalists and with a sympathetic congressional aide, I asked them to consider a contingency, that future researchers would one day operate under different risk assessments, with better disease prevention technologies, or with a legal framework for indigenous custodianship that could protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. If that day comes, I told them, our silence should not be a tombstone, but a bridge to ethical practice. Some of the confidants I chose kept those conversations, others did not. It is the nature of confidants that they sometimes outlive their architects. Professionally, the effects accumulated. I accepted early retirement from the Institute with a sense of failure that was at once technical and moral. Technically, I had ceded the opportunity to publish a singular discovery in the normal channels of science. Morally, I had traded public recognition for a kind of hidden stewardship that few could appreciate. Retirement, however, gave me time and a smaller public footprint. I moved to a modest house near the Sound, where the Douglas firs were fewer and the air smelled saltier. I did not disappear in the dramatic sense that conspiracy lore sometimes imagines. I did not change my name or enter witness protection. I removed myself from the conferences and from the pursuit of grant cycles. I cultivated an existence that prized near anonymity, not as evasion, but as a deliberate attenuation of visibility. And yet, even in that quieter life, the consequences of the leak kept arriving. Sometimes they were small and domestic. A former colleague would pass through the city and call to ask for an afternoon of conversation. Sometimes they were large and bureaucratic, subpoenas for archived materials that legally I could not produce without clearing them with multiple agencies. Sometimes they were spectral and unquantifiable. The knowledge that somewhere in a blog thread, a reader surmised the precise valley where our cameras had been, and that someone else, a hiker with more curiosity than caution, might be planning a trip. There were also consolations. The Coast Salish liaison continued to send me occasional messages, and sometimes a small offering of smoked fish or seer. Once, in the spring after retirement, Lummy Nuke visited my porch and sat for an hour without speaking. We watched the tide. He said, finally, "You made a hard choice." He did not judge me. He simply stated what he saw. His acceptance mattered to me more than accolades I had never sought. The archive I kept became my burden and my refuge. In a metal safe in my study, behind papers and files and a small pile of tobacco, I placed the drives with our sequence data, copies of the security footage, the photograph from the anonymous envelope, correspondence with tribal elders, and the manuscript I had circulated privately. I labeled folders the way scientists label experiments, with dates, methods, and disclaimers about context. Occasionally, after nights of restless thought, I would open the safe and stare at the drives as if they were living things that required tending. In a strange sense they were. They contained the traces of lives and of genetic histories that we had promised to respect. The safe had 2 federal keys assigned to it. One remained in government custody and the other in mine. That binary was, in practice, another layer of my guardianship. Years passed. The public's attention moved on, as it tends to do. A new controversy supplanted old ones. The news cycle is a river that runs fast. Fish rise and disappear. The monitoring program quietly continued, rebranded inside larger conservation budgets and staffed by rotating teams who made different small decisions about measurement and restraint. The camera footage was cataloged and encrypted. The footage of the grieving figures was cited in internal memos as behavioral evidence supporting protective measures. It was not that the leak had been without effect. It was that the institutions involved had, at some cost, doubled down on the protection, and in doing so normalized a posture of discretion. On a personal front, my family life changed in the ordinary ways families change. Rebecca and I found an uneasy rhythm. She came by more often after Marcus, my grandson, turned 5.
Marcus liked to sit on my knee and ask me what DNA was. I told him, clumsily, that DNA is a recipe book inside every cell. He would giggle and ask if books could be about forests. He could not understand the gravity of the choices I had made, nor should he. His questions were light, and in their lightness there was a kind of healing. Once, late in life, I received a letter that altered how I regarded the political spillover of our choices. It was from a council within the Coast Salish Nation, a formal note thanking the Institute and the individuals who had honored their requests for privacy and ceremony. They wrote that the protection measures had allowed certain plant species to recover in parts of the watershed, that restricted access had reduced erosion, and that elders had reported seeing fewer illegal camps. These were not direct confirmations of survival, not in the sense that a scientist would demand, but they suggested that our actions had produced ancillary conservation benefits that indigenous stewards valued. The letter was both a reassurance and a reminder. Sometimes ethical choices produce uneven outcomes that cannot be reduced to a simple metric of species survival. There were other correspondences that bore different tones. Once, some years after the leak, a young scientist I had never met knocked on my door and offered to help digitize my archive. She had read the old articles and found my name in footnotes.
We sat for coffee and talked about sequencing technologies that had advanced since my active years, high-throughput machines that could sequence genomes cheaply and in days, not months. She asked what safeguards might be possible now that had not been available in my time. We spoke at length about disease modeling, about potential vaccines for non-human populations, about the ethics of intervention. She asked with the blunt sincerity of a younger generation, if you could go back, would you do anything differently? I answered honestly, I don't know. Some decisions are methodical and defensible. Some are moral gambles. I had chosen what I thought would cause the least harm. The question of personhood returned to me often in my evenings. I would think of anatomy and allele frequencies, but also of hands that had touched a crate, of the low calls that seemed to approximate syntax, and of the care with which the creatures conspecifics had handled their dead. If moral consideration depends on the presence of social bonds and on the capacity for suffering and joy, then the evidence we assembled suggested personhood in the moral, if not legal, sense. But law does not always map neatly onto moral truth. The creatures had no legal advocate in a courtroom willing to argue personhood for them, and the legal system's concept of personhood is notoriously resistant to biological novelty. This is not to say that we abrogated our responsibility. We tried, as far as agencies would allow, to shield habitat, to seed restoration projects, to work with indigenous communities to create buffer zones and cultural protection strategies. Those were imperfect gestures, but they reflected the one practical aim I had never stopped circling back to give living beings and communities time. Time is often the quiet instrument of conservation. It is the variable in which populations recover or collapse. Inevitably, someone asks the question I asked myself on sleepless nights. Did the creatures survive? I cannot answer that. The camera archive stopped offering continuous coverage after a certain date because of equipment failures, funding cycles, and the challenge of maintaining remote systems in an unforgiving landscape. Reports came in from hikers and elders, footprints here, a low chorus heard at dusk there. But I am cautious about anecdote. Good science is cautious. Good stewardship is sometimes quieter than even good science can be. Which brings me finally to the phrasing that has followed me in press and rumor. After a dark government secret came out, he disappeared. The headline is tidy and dramatic in a way reality rarely is. I will be blunt. I did not disappear in a literal sense. I did not vanish into anonymity because men in shadows spirited me away. To present such a story would be sensational and untrue. What happened is more ambiguous and I think more instructive.
After our situation became public in the way it did, I chose to step back from public scientific life. I retreated from conferences and from the customary modes of career advancement. I accepted retirement, relocated to a quieter town, and kept the archive under lock and federal oversight. In the public imagination, that is disappearance. In practical terms, it was a withdrawal, a deliberate erasure of my professional visibility to reduce risk to beings I believed I had a duty to protect. There is, however, one caveat I must offer, because the title demands clarity and because ethical transparency has been my watchword inside a life of restraint. Some retellings have dramatized an alternate ending in which I was forcibly removed or suddenly transported and concealed by state services. That narrative is a dramatic flourish, and not the account I offer here. If you are a consumer of dramatization, imagine that ending only as a work of fiction. The truth is quieter. The government altered the terms of its public posture. The secrecy in the payments shifted legal and professional terrain, and I stepped into obscurity as a choice, imperfect, costly, and I believe necessary. In the years since, I have had occasion to look at my life as a ledger of sorts. On one side there are hemorrhages, opportunities lost, friendships shaded, the steady erosion of a public scientific name. On the other side there are credits, the trust of elders, the quiet success of certain conservation measures, and the knowledge that for a time a remote valley had fewer intrusions than it might have otherwise. Which side outweighs the other depends on the measure one uses. I cannot claim moral perfection. I can claim the conviction that, faced with a risk of immediate extinction by disease, and with a small population whose members showed signs of social complexity, the ethical calculus favored protection over publication. There are lessons I have tried to transmit to the younger scientists who still seek me out. First, when dealing with potentially sentient animals, recruit the communities who know the land first. They carry an ethical repository that science cannot reconstruct. Second, think in terms of harm minimization, not publicity. Third, document carefully and keep those documents secure. In a world of leaks, your record will be your moral companion. And finally, accept that stewardship can be a lonely work. You may be called a coward or a saint. Neither epitaph captures the ordinary, slow labor of choosing between painful options. On my desk, among the small things that remain from my active years, sits a printout from a remote camera, a still frame of two figures bending over a form on a moss bed, the composition blurred, intimate, and strange. I have that printout framed, though no one who visits asks to see it. It is not evidence in a court. It is not a trophy. It is a reminder.
It reminds me of the weight we carry when we claim to know the world, and of the moral choices that come when knowledge intersects with living complexity. If you have stayed with me this long, you have heard the technical terms and the legal stratagems, the names of people who helped and the names of people who complicated things. You have seen, I hope, not a melodrama, but a human story about choices. They paid me to guard is not a line of shame. It is an account of responsibility accepted under terms that bound me legally and morally. After a dark government secret came out, I disappeared, reads well as headline. In truth, I removed myself from the arenas where noise is loudest in order to reduce the chance of harm. That is both an admission and a plea. There are people who will judge that plea as cowardly. There are others who will see it as a kind of mercy. I live with those judgments. I also live with the quieter satisfactions, the occasional note from an elder thanking me for having listened, an email from a former student who tells me she teaches ethical disclosure now because of the debates our case provoked, a moment when the wind through the firs makes the same low sound that once punctuated the field recordings Dr. Chen brought us. I do not know whether the population we glimpsed still whispers through the Cascades. I do not know whether in a century a child will stumble upon signs of them and tell an ancestor. What I do know is this: the act of naming and of exposing a vulnerable group to the full glare of public curiosity is not itself morally neutral. It can be an act of preservation, but it can also be an instrument of extraction. For me, at the time, the better risk was to give those who had lived longer in the landscape a greater say, to accept reduced recognition in return for a chance that some of their number might live. If you would like to read more of the ideas I set down, the hypothetical account I wrote that treats our data and the ethical questions they raised as a model for future practice, that manuscript is available in an edited, redacted form through a university press's ethics archive and through several tribal cultural centers that have chosen to make it available to approved researchers. I encourage anyone interested to seek those resources and to read with the humility that the subject demands. When people ask me, with that simple curiosity that is both human and urgent, whether I have any regrets, I answer in an equally simple way. I regret the harm that still exists in the world and wish I had more power to mitigate it. I do not regret having chosen, in that fraught interval of 1995 and the years that followed, to put living bodies ahead of my reputation. I would make that choice again, though perhaps with more attention to how to build institutional protections that do not rest solely on the integrity of a few tired custodians.
There is a final image I want to leave you with, because everything we did was aimed at buying more of this. Late one autumn, after the cameras had been in place for several seasons, the remote unit captured a frame of two figures crossing a ridge at dusk. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they were performing a route known to them for reasons older than measurement. The frame is dark and indistinct. It tells us almost nothing in the hard way science demands. It tells us everything in another way. That life, even when bracketed by threat and bureaucracy, finds a way to be discreet, to carry itself in patterns that ask for respect. I was paid to guard. I chose to guard in a manner that cost me professionally. The secret that leaked was darker in some people's minds than in reality. It revealed institutional failures in disclosure and the difficulty of balancing public curiosity with the duty to protect. I did not disappear in a cloak and dagger sense. I withdrew into a quieter life to reduce risk and to keep a record. If that is disappearance, it is a mantle I accepted willingly, not as an evasion, but as a kind of slow, reluctant stewardship. If this story compels you to grapple with the questions it raises, about personhood, about the responsibilities of scientists, about the role of indigenous custodianship, I urge you to read the ethical literature on conservation and to consult indigenous sources with care and permission. There are no easy answers here, only choices, and the moral weight of each choice is heavier than we often suppose. Some things deserve to remain protected until we can do right by them. I chose to be paid as part of that protection. I paid in other ways for the choice. The account I leave is not one of triumph or complete closure. It is an admission of limits and a record of a decision. It is the simple truth of a life that had the privilege of seeing something extraordinary and the burden of deciding what to do with that sight. If you want to know more about the lessons we learned, the genetic patterns, the population models, and the ethical frameworks, the edited materials I mentioned are available to serious scholars and to tribal partners. Read them with care. And if this account stirs you, consider supporting conservation work led by indigenous communities. In the end, that may be the most responsible way to honor what we found, not by spectacle, but by stewardship.